David Stanley, if he would come to the podium to introduce our plenary speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Good evening. I'd like to join the other Utahns in welcoming you to Salt Lake City and to the state of Utah. There are 30-odd folklorists working in the state. This is the first meeting of the American Folklore Society held in Utah since 1978, and apparently you understand why. We'd like to welcome especially those of you who are attending AFS for the first time and our international colleagues from around the world. Meetings of this kind always have some unsung heroes who have worked hard and long behind the scenes to make things happen. And in that regard, I'd like to recognize the three folklorists from the Folk Arts program of the Utah Arts Council, Carol Edison, Craig Miller, and George Schumacher. And also Randy Williams from Utah State University. I don't know if she's here. For their incredible hard work and their contributions to the pre-conference tours, which many of you enjoyed today. The entertainment and dining guide is their work, the Saturday night dinner and dance, and many other local arrangements. The theme for this year's conference is Folklore in the Cultural Landscape. Utah is not only the repository of a long history of folklore collection and scholarship, it's also a state with a lot of landscape, cultural and otherwise, of a most remarkable diversity. And those of you who went on the tours today know what I mean. In keeping with that theme, I'm privileged to introduce tonight Dr. YiFu Tuan, Professor Emeritus of Geography at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a scholar who has written extensively on sense of place, ideas of space, landscape, and culture. Dr. Tuan is an appropriate and indeed inevitable choice for our meeting for many other reasons as well. Though often classed as a cultural geographer, it is far more accurate to describe him as a humanistic geographer. And in that respect, he has much in common with folklorists in his disenchantment with disciplinary boundaries and their consequent limitations of human inquiry. His breadth of interests overlaps many of ours as well: cultural symbolism, ethnocentrism, the sacred and the mythical, the phenomenology of the body and of human experience, the dynamic tension between individual creativity and commitment to community. As the titles of his nearly 20 books attest, his wealth of interests and concerns ranges well beyond the sometimes narrowly constructed dialectic of nature and culture to address fundamental human issues: aesthetics, perception, personality, morality, identity, and spirituality. One of his most influential books, particularly for environmental historians, philosophers, and folklorists, is Topophilia, subtitled A Study of Environmental Perception, Attitudes, and Values. Its successor, Space and Place, The Perspective of Experience, demonstrates Dr. Tuan's adventuresome and individualistic approach in evaluating the interactions of human perception and experience. In his 1998 work, Escapism, he advances the uncommon and startling notion that human cultural expressions, including ritual, festival, and storytelling, are forms of escapism from nature, from its uncertainties and its threats. This work, Escapism, will be discussed at the annual Text and Community Forum to be held tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. in the Wyoming Room. In these and other works, Dr. Tuan has investigated the relationship of humans to their pets, animal pets, but also human pets, and intriguingly, inorganic ones, in addition to the symbolism of foodways, the notion of home beyond the simplistic notions of shelter and comfort, the affective bond between people and place or setting, as he said in Topophilia, even the human constructions of heaven, hell, and the good life. He has been recognized for his achievements by many professional organizations, including the Association of American Geographers, the American Geographical Society, the International Geographical Union, and the Phi Beta Kappa Society, not to mention several honorary degrees and 2 collections of essays recently published in his honor. His wide-ranging knowledge of fields ranging from landscape architecture to urban planning to contemporary theology to literature to environmental studies, combined with a lucid, subtle, and remarkably witty writing style, have established him as an influential scholar in a dozen different disciplines. The complexity of his thought and the multitude of his influences have led him inexorably to fundamental human questions of self, community, and locale. As he wrote in the epilogue to Space and Place, his ultimate goal is to, quote, increase the burden of awareness in common with the thrust of humanistic enterprise. His talk tonight is entitled Folklore and Place, 4 Themes. Please welcome to this AFS meeting Dr. YiFu Tuan.
I was naturalized a citizen of the United States in 1973. And in 1975, I went to Australia as a Fulbright. And before I started on the trip to Australia, I got this letter from the State Department asking me to be sure to behave well because I now represent the USA. So I went to Australia, and this was 1975. And there was a reception of Australian academics, and I was the outsider. I was the Fulbrighter. In the reception, the discussion got very heated since the Vietnam War was still on, and the Australian academics were strongly anti-Vietnam War. So they got more and more heated. Finally, they saw me, and one of them came to me and pointed at me and said, "The trouble with you Americans." And I quickly looked behind and said, "Who, me?" I mean, I'm telling this story because Dr. Stanley's very generous introduction made me want to look back and say, "Who, me?" I'm honored to be asked to address a convention of American folklorists. Not being a folklorist myself, I thought that one service I can usefully perform is to pose certain questions, naive in both content and phrasing, that no real scholar of folklore would want to pose. Questions that, for all their obviousness to the elders of the discipline, may be overlooked by younger scholars swamped by the intellectual challenges of the day. I have 4 questions or themes in mind. First, what is the relationship between a genre of storytelling and a unit of land, for example, between folklore and landscape? Second, we know that fear, a common element in the experiencing of place in earlier times, has diminished in our time. And so the question is, will that shudder of fear eventually disappear altogether? Third, what is the moral content in folklore? What is the ethical aspiration in folk society? Fourth and last, human beings everywhere and in all times speak easily of an emotional bond between them and external reality? What if the bond is an illusion? We start then with the relationship between a genre of storytelling and a unit of land, which for this year's convention is folklore and cultural landscape. As a geographer, I'm somewhat surprised by the coupling, for I would have thought that folklore and place is more precise. But this may be a consequence of my ill-informed understanding of the word folklore and my better informed understanding of the word landscape. Folklore, to me, is the lore of non-literate or semi-literate folk who live in the penumbra of great cities. The study came about when, in the 19th century, scholars realized that a rich oral tradition in the countryside was threatened by the products of commercial culture that spewed forth from the cities. The lore or stories that scholars collected from hamlets, villages, and nomadic camps showed a folk's intimate involvement with a particular locality or region, which is what I mean by place. What are the intimacies of place? It is uncritical immersion. Home, for example, is truly home when it is an all-encompassing milieu, not something out there that one looks at and appraises. It is an outcome of the use of the proximate senses of touch, smell, and taste, rather than of the distant senses of hearing and sight. It is an effect of people working close together on the land. Their bodies touch, their sweat intermingles to knead separate identities into group identity, a group self. Place is universal. Landscape, by contrast, is a special take on place that is far from being universal. Only two civilizations, European and Chinese, have independently developed and embraced it. And what is landscape? Although the word originally meant a legally defined unit of land, it has come to mean a view of scenery contemplated from a point above ground level. Unlike place or milieu, landscape is primarily a construction of the dominant sense of sight. To see far and well, one needs to stand on a prominence and make sure that one's sight lines are not blocked. Who might want to do so? Who would enjoy a visual composition of village, hills, and valleys? Answer: a single person of leisure and artistic inclination, or at most, a small group of like-minded persons with time and leisure on their hands, and not, I would think, hardworking folk. A view can be captured in art, as in landscape painting. The painting of a view necessarily tries to depict what is seen rather than what is conceived. What is seen is a perspectival, three-dimensional world, a world with depths that the viewer feels he can enter. When did people first attempt at a faithful depiction of a view? When did landscape painting first come into being? Classical antiquity already had landscape painting on its garden walls to open up space, but the art form disappeared. It was revived around 1400 when people became dissatisfied with mere symbolic understanding of the sort they had in the Middle Ages, and concomitantly a growing desire to know what it was actually like to be present at, say, the Last Supper, sitting at the right hand of the Lord, or accompanying him on the dusty road to Golgotha. People wanted paintings and drawings to help them in that understanding, in that, if you like, illusion. And they wanted their stories to be able to do that too, to go beyond legend and hagiography to something truer to life. As landscape painting gained popularity, storytelling changed its style to include ones that offered a more personal viewpoint, a fuller exposition of the psychology of the characters. Medieval romances mutated into 17th and 18th century novels. Both exhibited what might be called a plot. Their narrative lines point to a climax or resolution in the future. In this respect, they resemble landscape painting in that it too was and is characteristically directional, the lines of perspective guiding the eye to a promising patch of blue sky or a church spire in the distance. As distinct from the romance and the novel, the epic is focused even more on an individual hero or on a small group of intrepid people. Think of Lawrence of Arabia or the pioneer settlers of the American West. They pursued their respective quests against the landscape so huge that it can seem empty or abstract. Folklore is anchored in place or locality. The romance and the novel, by contrast, are set in landscape and evoke landscape, which, unlike place, opens out to a horizon. An effect of this openness to a horizon and the sense of possibility it produces is that the people in a landscape are subject to atmosphere and mood rather than to harsher constraints. I'm tempted to say that the novel and the short story are studies of atmosphere and mood, those of people interwoven with those of landscape. Atmosphere is a quality of landscape. A physical phenomenon, it is yet imbued with subjective meaning, made evident by such common epithets as gloomy, cheerful, and sad. Mood is more closely identified with human beings. Moods, they alone, human beings alone, truly have mood. Neither, I surmise, is prominent in folklore, nor do I see them as characteristic features of the epic. In an epic, the forces that heroes and heroines confront tend to be overpowering, either violently hostile, as in a raging blizzard, or wolves on the rampage, or utter indifference, as the blind stare of sand and stone that taunts travelers dying of thirst. Constable painted landscapes, and I can imagine them as settings for a novel or a story. Turner, by contrast, painted turbulent nature, and I can imagine his seascapes as the inspiration behind the recent movie Epic, Master and Commander. To return to folk and folklore, the folks that scholars have studied, though they lived in the country, were part of a larger world that included the city. A country folk's lore was therefore likely to include elements drawn from the works of a literate society. These works opened up their space, making their life less place-bound and claustrophobic. In Europe, that larger world was Christianity. And so, to tales of spirits and demons that haunted the local place was interwoven a lore of greater scope, one that featured a drama of salvation played out on the stage of heaven, earth, and hell. In this regard, the worlds depicted by folklorists and ethnographers differ. Unlike folklorists, ethnographers tended to study isolated people who lived beyond the influence of great cities, people who were untouched by Christianity or any other great religious tradition. Their law may nevertheless be two-tiered, a lower layer of spirits that interacted with people in their daily rounds, and a more remote cosmic layer, the structure of which, to give one example, was famously told by the Oglala Sioux black elk. Pointing to the 4 ribbons hanging on the stem of his sacred pipe, he explained, and I quote, "These are the 4 quarters of the universe. The black one is for the west, where the thunder beings live to send us rain. The white one is for the north, whence comes the great white cleansing wind. The red one is for the east, whence springs the light and where the morning star lives to give man wisdom. The yellow is for the south, whence comes summer and the power to grow." The upper or cosmic layer of the Oglala Sioux shows a stability and grandeur that the lower layer, based on experience with the difficulties of daily life, cannot and does not have. My second theme is fear in a haunted world. People in the past had to struggle hard to make a living. Their world, constantly under the threat of nature, was full of uncertainty. One way to cope with it was to tell stories. These, even as they reduced fear, also revealed its extent. We in modern society easily forget the pervasiveness of this fear in the countryside. We forget for various reasons and under various influences, including the subtle influence of impressionist paintings that seductively show us a peaceful world of village ponds, haystacks, and gentle folk picnicking on the grass. Such art can induce Edenic fantasies among the bourgeoisie. As to what life was really like for those who lived close to the soil, consider France, a civilized part of Europe in the 1900s. The historian Eugene Weber wrote, and I quote, "Everything was of fearsome or fantastic potent. The buzzing of insects announced a ghostly hunt. The ribbons of mist above the marshes were mysterious drivers of clouds. Newly pruned elms, shadows, or haze turned into sinister fancies. The moonlight was crowded with goblins, sprites, elves, imps, werewolves, and bogeymen. Before the First World War, fountains, wells, and springs were a widespread cult in rural France, so much so that some fountains of high repute must have looked like, again to quote Weber, Japanese temple groves with votive rags, ribbons, and articles of clothing draped over them and over all the surrounding growths. What of the United States, a brave new world founded by the followers of the Enlightenment? As recently as the 1940s, backwoodsmen in the Ozarks lived in omen-filled places. Some wouldn't drive down a road if they saw a little whirlwind on it, for to do so could bring bad luck. Others buried the entrails of a black hen under the hearth on January the 6th or 12th night to protect their house against destruction by lightning or fire. In the remote hills and hollows of Tennessee or Kentucky, ghosts and witches were, in the 1920s and 30s, as much a part of a living tradition as dying in one's own home and maintaining the family graveyard. a country lane or covered bridge, so picturesque to the passing tourist on a sunny day, could seem threatening to the man trudging home as the shadows deepened. Without doubt, hauntedness has diminished in the Western world. Will it disappear one day? Will a time come when ghost stories seem suitable only as backdrop for children to do trick or treat, or become merely occasions for college students to hug their dates and scream, as in the Rocky Horror Picture shows? I don't think so. My own experience supports the idea that it is human to feel, however rarely, the touch of clammy fingers beyond the grave. Before I proceed further, let me say that I am an admirer of modern science, and that I tend to look down on beliefs and practices that do not fall under its scope. True, I may still bear the scars of ghost stories told me as a child in China. I then lived in fear of shadows beneath the stairs. But when I moved to the West and grew to manhood among technological marvels, I put away childish fears. But have I? Is it even possible to eradicate them totally? In 1980 or thereabout, I, as a faculty member of the University of Minnesota, occupied an office on the 5th floor of a tall building. Every day and almost every other night, I worked in my office. Some nights on Sundays and public holidays, I was the only one in the building, for I could see from the courtyard outside that only my office had its lights on. One cold December day, I stepped out of the building and almost stepped on a corpse sprawled face up on the ice-covered pavement. Later, I learned that she was a secretary who worked 2 floors above mine, and that she had committed suicide. I continued to work at night. On Christmas Eve of that year, I was, as usual, alone. In the unnatural silence, silent except for the sound of the elevator sliding up and down the well of the building, I couldn't rid myself of the image of the stiff white face and its halo of blood-stained yellow hair. I sat at my desk, tried to write, but my attention was gripped by the sucking sound of the moving elevator 20 feet or so away. It stopped on my floor. I heard the doors open. My blood turned to ice water as I waited for the inevitable. Ever since that fright, I refrained from staying late in my office. Of course, on busy work days, when the building thronged with students, I could laugh at the tricks of my limbic brain. Nevertheless, for me, that blandly modern building tower is always vulnerable to invasion by denizens from another world. The good that came out of this experience is that I now have a better appreciation of the spirit-infested world in which people once lived. It goes without saying that even in that world, the haunting was restricted to certain hours and occasions. Most of the day, we may assume that people were too busy making a living, digging, plowing, planting, and harvesting, minding the children, and quarreling with neighbors. Perhaps only at night and during twilight hours, when hush descended upon the earth, that a certain uncanny power took over. Even so, dealing with it could be surprisingly matter-of-fact. To take again the Ozarks, there one tied ribbons to a tree to appease its spirit, buried the entrails of a black hen to ensure that lightning did not strike one's house, was alert not to close a gate that stood open, made sure that one did not leave a neighbor's house by the same door through which one entered, and so on. People negotiated with the supernatural as they did with the natural and the social, by following rules. These were numerous and could seem onerous to the modern mind. In time, they became routine and manageable, although there was always the anxiety that one might have unwittingly broken a rule with dire consequence. That was the extra burden, a burden beyond the natural and the social we should be glad to have left behind. My third theme is the moral content of stories. To broach it, I need to return to the harshness of life. Folklore is a constant reminder of this harshness, of having to cope with a nature that often acted unpredictably and is seldom generous. To survive, endless chores must be attended to. Hard work is therefore a necessity, not a virtue. In France, folk tales of the old regime, as one scholar put it, and I quote, constantly show parents laboring in the fields while the children gather wood, guard sheep, fetch water, spin wool, or bag. Far from condemning the exploitation of child labor, parents could sound indignant when it does not occur. Faced with a dreary and difficult life at home, some try to escape it by taking to the road. The road is thus not a lure. It does not promise gold at the end of the rainbow. People are pushed onto it. The fortunate few travel as journeymen, picking up jobs as they can. The vast majority stumble about as beggars. Another means of escape is through fantasy. How touchingly modest folklore fantasies can be. When dreams come true, the hero is left in the well-stocked barnyard rather than in Never Never Land. Magic wands or rings are plentiful in the French folklore, but the best they have to offer is food. And if they are truly powerful, not just any food, but a side of mutton, pork, or beef that one can sink one's teeth into. Today's men and women, in reaction against what they consider to be the coldness and impersonality of their world, tend to romanticize the past, evoke the idyllic images of village life, the latest exemplar of which being the Middle Earth of the hobbits in the movie The Lord of the Rings. But real folk tales often tell quite another story. Not niceness, but nastiness may be the order of the day. Neighbors are presumed to be hostile and may be witches. You should never discuss your affairs in front of them, or let them know in case you acquire sudden wealth by some stroke of magic, for they will denounce you as thief if they fail to steal it themselves. The story La Poupée shows how an orphan girl learns the lesson of mistrust. The girl receives a magic doll which excretes gold whenever she says, "Crap, crap, my little rag doll." Before long, She has bought several chickens and a cow and invites the neighbors in. One of them pretends to fall asleep by the fire and runs off with the doll as soon as the girl goes to bed. But when he says the magic words, it craps real crap all over him. So he throws it on the dung heap. Then one day, when he's doing some crapping of his own, it reaches up and bites him. He cannot pry it loose from his derriere until the girl arrives, reclaims her property, and lives mistrustfully forever. Although folklore tales don't actually preach selfishness, they show that good deeds are not always rewarded, and that moreover, refraining from doing good might be necessary to achieve one's goal, as for example, in the story of a hero who escapes with the princess only because he refuses to help a beggar drowning in a lake. Fantasy abounds in folk tales, as does realism. But the realism is restricted to human relationships and does not extend, for lack of scientific understanding, to the many relationships that exist between the forces of nature and human beings. Reading about folks who lived in the 19th century and earlier, I have wondered how one tale, that of Christianity, fitted in. Surely not well, for the Gospels are fundamentally stories of hope and of virtue rewarded, even if the path to the reward is full of thorns. And what about the Sermon on the Mount? For a people soaked in the harsh realism of human relationship, how strange it is to be told that if someone asks you for your shirt, you should also let him have your coat. I'd like to know what parts of the Christian story French peasants of the old regime were able to accept, and what parts they automatically rejected as altogether too contrary to experience. Plenitude in heaven and suffering in hell, particularly if the retribution were coupled with the idea of revenge, probably rang a bell. But what about exhortations to superhuman charity? In early modern times, the message of the Gospels still formed a backcloth, however thin and tattered, for thinking about right and wrong, goodness and its reward in all layers of society. Did any part of the message irradiate the peasant's world with a warm glow, bringing a fleeting gladness, a real sense of possibility into their lives? Stories inevitably carry a moral message, one of cunning and mistrust in some folk tales, one of goodness and its ultimate recompense in some modern fairy tales, one of moral ambiguity and virtual discernment in some of the greatest novels of the 19th century, those written, for example, by Dickens, Flaubert, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy. It is a simplification, but not a mistake, to say that Dickens shows us the face of human decency in the midst of bitter economic and social realities. Flaubert immunizes us against the inanities of bourgeois life. Dostoevsky depicts societies that, however mundane or brutal, nevertheless allow spiritual infiltration. Tolstoy, like his great predecessor, Homer, celebrates life, nature, and the world, notwithstanding their warts and horrors. Words have power. The stories that we are constantly telling one another alter our moral compass, however slightly. Cynical stories make us a little more cynical. Stories of heroism and virtue make us a little braver, a little more willing to smile at the bag lady. Sloppily written narratives incline us to sloppiness, well-written ones to seeing that choosing the right word may be a moral choice. With words, we create ourselves and our relationships to people, nature, and artifacts. There appears to exist, however, a peculiar bias in our psychology, namely, words directed to the negatives of life, slander and hatred, cruelty and horror, have a firmer grip on our imagination than words directed to the positives of life, praise and celebration, contentment and joy, acts of courage and compassion. A single tragic event, the woman's suicide in a campus building, has altered my perception of it, my sense of ease in it. Can a single good event do the same? And what might that be? Even a casually told ghost story can make me wander in the darkness of night and on a lonely road whether there is an unwelcome guest wrapped in death's shroud in the back seat of my car. As for sunny stories of happiness and virtue, will they be able to make me smile, feel good about places or landscapes in which they are set? Strange, isn't it, that I, a fairly rational man, should take ghost stories seriously and yet be dismissive of stories about good people and good deeds as somehow sentimental, vacuous, or unreal. But I exaggerate. I would like to offer two stories that have affected my view of landscape in a positive way. The first gives it a warm glow, the second an aura of holiness. One July day in 1667, Samuel Pepys and his friends went for a stroll up the Epsom Downs. They met there a shepherd and his little boy. The boy was reading the Bible to his father. Pepys made the boy read to him and was charmed by his eager, forced tone that children usually read. The visitors complimented the father, who, his chest swelling with pride, blessed God for his young son. I'm not sure I understand why an event that happened almost 350 years ago and recorded matter-of-factly by Pepys in his diary should cast for me a warm and permanent glow. I will always see Epsom Downs through the lens of the shepherd and his boy. The second story is taken from the novel *ThePhilosophers Pupil* by Iris Murdoch. Four young people were picnicking somewhere in southern England near the coast. One of them, known for his good voice, was persuaded to sing, and he sang Blake's beautiful anthem. And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountain green? And was the holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pasture seen? And did countenance divine shine upon our clouded hills? I don't understand the poem, said Haiti, after they had congratulated the singer. Why is he asking, did those feet? It's a poem, said Tom. It doesn't have to mean anything exact. It is a sort of rhetorical question. He's just imagining Christ here. But perhaps he was here, said the singer. After all, there's that legend. What legend? Said Tom. that Christ was here. Where? Yes, in England as a child. He came here as a child with his uncle, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a tin merchant. Did he? Christ, here. It is a legend. Haven't you heard it? No. But it's wonderful, said Tom, suddenly transported. And it could be true. Fancy Christ here, walking on our fields. It's so beautiful, and it's great. He came with his uncle Joseph of Arimathea as a child. Oh, that makes me so happy. I must go. I must run. What for? I must tell somebody. I must pass the news on. Oh, I'm so pleased. I must run and run. With these words, Tom vaulted over one of the low parts of the wall and ran across the ruined terrace littered with broken stone, leaped to the grass, and began to run away as fast as he could toward the sea. I read this passage in the novel several times. Each time I was made happy by it. Like Tom, England will never again be quite the same for me. How do I explain its power? The beauty of Blake's poem, images of young people at leisure, Tom's boyish enthusiasm, all have contributed to my good feeling, which then spills over to the landscape. But without doubt, it is also the power of the legend itself, the idea that the child, who is no less the Holy Lamb of God, has walked with his uncle on England's green pastures. I now turn to my fourth and last theme, indifference, the world's fundamental indifference. I believe should always be at the back of our mind when we talk of relationships, those between people and those between people on the one hand and on the other, plants, animals, inanimate objects, including places and landscapes. By relationship, I'm not thinking of physical ones that are the subject matter of ecological science, the fact that people feed off the flesh of animals, who in turn feed off other animals and plants. Nor am I concerned with the emotions of higher animals, those of fear, anger, and affection that surge forth as they compete, fight, and mate, take care of their young, and bond with one another in common tasks. Rather, I raise a question that is applicable only to humans. It is this. When we humans feel intimacy with another being, does it rest on real mutuality, real communication and understanding? Or is it au fond, an illusion we dare not do without? We dread being alone, disconnected from all that surrounds us. True, a certain mutual sympathy, an ability to stand in the other person's shoes is possible if we live in the same place and speak the same language. But note that even in that favorable circumstance, we instinctively recognize the fragility of human exchange by narrowing our topics of conversation to the weather and other trivialities. Plunge deeper, speak our true insights and feelings, and we may well find ourselves confronted by disagreement and hostility. Worse than that, worse than even disagreement and hostility, which after all imply a degree of attentiveness, is the sheer lack of interest, sheer indifference. Mutual understanding below a rather superficial level is highly tenuous. Our works of fiction, which thrive on social miscues, can hardly exist without them, provide an important line of evidence. As for our relationship with animals, Its emotional strength is not to be doubted and is proven by the use of such honorifics as companion and friend, and by making animals, for example, the lion, the dove, and the owl, symbols respectively of the virtues of courage, gentleness, and wisdom. A widespread myth has it that long ago, humans and animals spoke the same language and so were able to share one another's experiences and worlds, but they lost it. Henceforth, humans had to depend on bodily stance and gesture, uncertain signs that could invite fantasies of mutuality. Consider the domesticated dog, whom we regard as our best friend. How many of us have dared to probe that friendship by trying to enter its world? What, after all, do we know of canine reality? What is it like to have a sense of smell far superior to our own? Isn't it plausible that the dog recognizes us as a peculiar odor than as a charming image, the image we dearly love to have of ourselves? Beyond living things is the vast inanimate world of mountains and hills, wind and rain. Today, as in the past, we give them human characteristics and motivations, even ones of malice, anything but total indifference. The blockbuster movie Twister, made in 1996, is about a tornado. Of course, it cannot be presented as just a lesson in thermodynamics. To the ordinary moviegoer, and even to the professional meteorologist in a relaxed mood, the twister is a villain that chases and big game to be chased. Nature can't care less whether I have a roof over my head or not. But what about the things we have made ourselves? They surely respond to our needs, and they do most of the time, though not always. The hammer I use to hit a nail on the head is just as happy hitting my finger. Note that I have given the hammer unwittingly a touch of malice, which proves my point, namely that it goes against the deepest grain of our nature to see total impersonality and indifference in the world out there. We refuse to learn the lesson, no matter how often it is given. Yet, the following story momentarily shocked me to wakefulness. 4 friends went on a yachting trip in the Mediterranean. It was a warm, calm day. The sea was as smooth as glass. The yacht drifted to a stop. Before taking lunch, the friends decided to jump into the sea for a swim. They splashed about happily, and having worked up an appetite, and thinking no doubt of the tenderly baked chicken on the table and the bottle of chilled wine in the fridge, they decided to climb aboard. To their horror, after repeated tries, they found they could not. The boat rose too high above water, and since it was unanchored, the swimmers had no chain to haul themselves up with. They all drowned. I see in my mind's eye the swimmers in their last desperate moments, wondering as their arms turned to lead at the utter indifference of everything around them: the serene sky, the calm sea, the smooth flanks of the boat, and the tenderly baked chicken. There's nothing more human than telling stories. We need them as much as we need food and water to survive. Food and water feed our body. Stories our soul, or that part of soul that yearns for emotional reciprocity. Stories about what is out there differ. Some people say this is true, others contest it and offer their version. What we all forget in the effort to tell our story well, or in the excitement of its defense or contestation, is a more elemental fact, namely that all stories, in the very nature of human language, contains exaggerated connectivity. They are, in this sense, fantasies. Surprising, isn't it, that we need fantasies even more than we need realism to remain wholesome and sane.
Dr. Tuan would be glad to entertain a couple of questions or comments.
Frankly, I wasn't quite prepared for questions. I dare to say these things because I said I'm surely safe from criticism because I'm the only amateur in this whole group. Anyway, questions?
You were very careful not to tell us who got out of the lift.
Pardon?
You were very careful not to tell us who got out of the lift.
Oh.
Usually elevator.
Well, of course, I mean, the simplest answer for me to say is that nobody. That this lift operates automatically, but it just runs up down until it's pressed and then it stops. Well, I know there's nobody in the building, so it's okay for the build just slide up and down. But why would it stop on my floor? And I hear the doors open, and it is most extraordinary feeling I had. So my simple answer and rational answer is that no one appeared. But my imagination was so worked up that I might as well have said that this ghost did appear, because it still haunts me. I mean, how can something that's totally not there still be a fact in my life today? Well, thank you.